In the heart of the Texas frontier, where dust and pride run equally deep, a wealthy cattle baron named Clayton Mercer built an empire on hard work and harder choices. He was a man who measured success in land and livestock, a man who believed money could solve any problem and buy any respect. But on one scorching afternoon in the small town of Red Creek, a barefoot little girl with torn clothes and haunting eyes approached him on the main street. She grabbed his calloused hand with surprising strength and whispered just 3 words that would change everything he thought he knew about wealth and family. What could possibly be waiting inside that crumbling shack at the edge of town that would bring the most powerful man in the territory to his knees? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clayton Mercer's boots struck the wooden planks of Red Creek's main street with the confidence of a man who owned half the territory. At 52 years old, his face bore the deep lines of sun and decisions, each crease a testament to the ruthless determination that had carved the Mercer holdings from raw Texas soil. His hat, a fine Stetson that cost more than most families earned in a month, sat perfectly angled on silver-streaked hair. Everything about Clayton spoke of control, of power carefully measured and deliberately displayed. The leather-bound ledger, tucked under his arm, contained the meticulous records of his empire. Every head of cattle, every acre of land, every dollar earned and spent, all documented in his precise handwriting. Numbers never lied. Numbers never disappointed. Numbers were the only truth Clayton trusted anymore. He had come to Red Creek that morning for a business meeting with the cattle buyers from Kansas City. The deal had gone well, as his deals always did. Clayton knew how to negotiate, how to read men's tells, when to press and when to wait. It was a skill he had honed over 30 years of building his fortune from nothing. Well, almost nothing. His father had left him a small ranch and a mountain of debt. Clayton had taken that struggling operation and transformed it into the largest cattle empire in 3 counties. The town of Red Creek existed largely because of him. The general store thrived on orders from his ranch. The saloon stayed busy with his cowboys. The blacksmith, the livery, the doctor, all of them depended on the Mercer money flowing through town like the creek the settlement was named for. Clayton understood this dynamic perfectly. Respect and fear were 2 sides of the same coin, and he collected both with equal efficiency. As he walked toward where his horse waited, hitched outside the Red Creek bank, Clayton reviewed his mental checklist for the afternoon. He needed to speak with Dutch, his foreman, about rotating the cattle to the southern pasture. There were fence repairs to oversee on the eastern boundary, and he wanted to review the books again tonight, looking for any inefficiencies, any waste that could be trimmed. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the dusty street into waves of shimmering heat. Clayton barely noticed. He had been born to this land, raised under this same relentless sky. The heat was just another thing to endure, to overcome through sheer willpower. His hand rested briefly on the bank's doorframe as he passed. Inside that building sat accounts bearing his name, figures that would make Eastern bankers pause in admiration. Clayton Mercer was not just wealthy. He was an institution, a force that shaped the economic reality of everyone within 100 miles. Yet for all his success, for all the tangible proof of his achievement, there remained an emptiness he refused to acknowledge. His ranch house, grand and spacious, echoed with silence. He took his meals alone in a dining room built for family gatherings that never happened. His bed, imported from St. Louis at considerable expense, held only him. Maria, his housekeeper, had been with him for 15 years. She kept the house immaculate, prepared his meals, and maintained a respectful distance. That was how Clayton preferred it. Professional. Uncomplicated. She received excellent wages and asked no personal questions. Dutch, his foreman, was similar, loyal, competent, and wise enough to know that Clayton's private thoughts remained private. There had been a wife once, briefly in his younger years. Elizabeth, she had left after 2 years, unable to bear the isolation of ranch life or the emotional distance of a husband who measured everything, including affection, with careful calculation. Clayton had let her go without protest, paid for her passage back to Philadelphia, and never spoke her name again. Marriage, he concluded, was an inefficiency he could not afford. The failure of his marriage had only reinforced what Clayton already believed. Emotions were liabilities. Attachments created vulnerabilities. The only reliable thing in this world was what you could build with your own 2 hands and protect with unwavering vigilance. He had a brother once too. Thomas. The thought arrived unbidden, as it sometimes did when Clayton's guard was down. Thomas had been 12 years younger, more of a son than a brother in many ways. Their father had died when Thomas was only 8, leaving Clayton at 20 to raise a boy while simultaneously trying to save a failing run. Clayton had done both, though he often wondered if he had done either well. He taught Thomas to ride, to work cattle, to read a balance sheet, but somewhere in those years of grinding labor and desperate financial calculations, he forgot to teach Thomas that it was acceptable to be soft sometimes. That strength did not require constant hardness. Thomas had grown into a good man despite Clayton's emotional limitations. He had been kind where Clayton was stern, gentle where Clayton was harsh. The ranch hands had loved Thomas in a way they respected, but never loved Clayton. Thomas remembered birthdays, asked about families, laughed easily and often. And then Thomas had died, 15 years ago, in an accident that still haunted Clayton's rare, unguarded moments. A piece of equipment had failed in the north pasture. Thomas had been working alone, which was unusual but not unheard of. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. Clayton had buried his brother on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a view of the land they had built together. He had stood at that grave, with dry eyes, his face a mask of control, even as something inside him calcified into permanent stone. After Thomas, Clayton stopped pretending that connections mattered. He doubled down on work, on expansion, on the pursuit of wealth as the only worthy goal. The ranch had tripled in size in the 15 years since Thomas's death. Clayton told himself this was honoring his brother's memory, building something that would last. But late at night, in moments he never acknowledged in daylight, he knew the truth. He was running, building walls of cattle and land and money between himself and the pain of loss. Maria had tried in her quiet way to reach him after Thomas died. She would leave his favorite foods, speak gently about memories, suggest he might want to talk to the past. Clayton had shut down each attempt with cold efficiency until she stopped trying. Dutch had been more direct, telling Clayton once that Thomas would not want him to become this hard. Clayton had nearly fired him for the presumption. Dutch had simply nodded and never mentioned it again. Now, as Clayton approached his horse, he pushed these thoughts away with practiced ease. The past was done. Thomas was gone. What mattered was the present, the tangible, the measurable. He had a ranch to run, an empire to maintain, and no time for the kind of sentimental weakness that destroyed lesser men. His horse, a magnificent black gelding named Justice, stood patiently at the hitching post. Clayton had paid top dollar for the animal, and it had proven worth every cent. Strong, reliable, and obedient, everything Clayton valued. He untied the reins, preparing to mount, his mind already moving to the afternoon's tasks. The fence repair could not wait. Dutch would have the men ready, and Clayton wanted to personally inspect the work. He trusted his foreman, but trust did not mean abdication of oversight. It was precisely this focus, this single-minded attention to the concrete details of his business, that made him vulnerable to what happened next. Clayton Mercer, who prided himself on awareness on reading situations before they developed, never saw her coming. Red Creek had a particular smell in summer. Dust and horse manure. Yes, but also the sweet scent of hay from the livery, bread baking at the boarding house, and the faint metallic tang of the creek itself. when the water ran low. Clayton knew this town as intimately as he knew his own ranch. Every building, every resident, every debt owed and favor granted. The general store belonged to Harold Pritchard, a nervous man who extended credit too easily and kept sloppy books. Clayton had bailed him out twice, loans that Pritchard would spend years repaying. The saloon was run by Big Jim Corrigan, and former boxer from New Orleans, who watered his whiskey and charged cowboys double when they were drunk. Clayton tolerated this because Big Jim kept order and made sure Mercer Ranch hands did not cause trouble in town. Doc Gildeomet Harrison had his practice above the apothecary, a dignified man in his 60s who had studied medicine in Boston before deciding he preferred the frontier to the city. He was competent, discreet, and treated Clayton with the professional courtesy of one successful man recognizing another. Maria consulted him occasionally for minor ailments, always on Clayton's account. The Red Creek Bank was managed by Virgil Stone, a cautious man who approved loans only after exhaustive review. Clayton respected this caution, even as he sometimes found it frustrating. Stone had refused to finance several of Clayton's more aggressive expansion plans, advice that in retrospect had probably saved Clayton from overextension during the drought years. These were Clayton's people, in the sense that they existed within his sphere of influence. He knew their businesses, their capabilities, their weaknesses, but he did not know their hearts, their dreams, their private sorrows. That kind of knowledge required an intimacy Clayton had long ago decided was unnecessary. The blacksmith's hammer rang out from the smithy, a familiar percussion that marked the town's rhythm. Somewhere a dog barked. A wagon rolled past, kicking up dust that hung in the still air. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary town, the kind of day Clayton had experienced 1,000 times before. He placed his boot in the stirrup, preparing to swing up into the saddle, when he felt it, a small hand grasping his with surprising strength. The touch was so unexpected that Clayton froze, his entire body going rigid with surprise. He looked down. A little girl stood beside him, her hand wrapped around his with desperate determination. She could not have been more than 7 years old, small for her age, with tangled dark hair that hung past her shoulders. Her dress, if it could be called that, was little more than a collection of stained rags held together with hope and thread. Her feet were bare, caked with the red dust of Texas soil. But it was her eyes that stopped Clayton's breath. Large, dark, and filled with a strange mixture of fear and determination that he recognized but could not immediately place. They were old eyes in a young face, eyes that had seen too much and understood more than they should. In her other hand, clutched with the same fierce grip she had on Clayton's fingers, was a torn blue ribbon, faded, dirty, but carefully preserved, despite its condition. The girl held it like a talisman, like it was the only thing in the world that mattered. Clayton's first instinct was to pull away, to call for someone to remove this child. But something in those eyes held him frozen, something familiar that tugged at memories he kept carefully locked away. The girl looked up at him, and when she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, hoarse as if from disuse or crying, or both. "Follow me home," 3 words, simple, wreaked, devastating. Clayton stared at her, his mind racing through possibilities. Was this some kind of scheme, a distraction for pickpockets? But even as these cynical thoughts formed, he knew they were false. This child was not acting. Her desperation was real, her need genuine. "Follow me home," she repeated, and this time it was not a request. It was a plea. Clayton became aware that people were watching. Across the street, Harold Pritchard had emerged from his store, wiping his hands on his apron. Near the saloon, 2 cowboys had paused their conversation to observe. Even Virgil Stone had appeared in the bank's doorway, his expression unreadable behind wire-rimmed spectacles. But what struck Clayton most was not that they were watching, it was how they were watching. There was recognition in their eyes, and something else, pity, perhaps. or sadness. They knew this child. They knew why she had approached him, and not one of them moved to intervene or assist. The girl tugged his hand gently, insistently. "Please," she added, the word cracking in the middle like a dry branch. Clayton had built his fortune on quick decisions, on trusting his instincts about risk and reward. Every successful deal came down to reading the situation, understanding the leverage, knowing when to commit. But this was no business transaction. This was a child, desperate and alone, asking him for something he did not understand. He should refuse. He should extract his hand politely, but firmly, mount justice and ride back to the ranch, where everything made sense, where legends and problems had solutions you could calculate. Instead, he heard himself say, "Show me." Relief flooded the girl's face so completely that Clayton felt something twist in his chest. When was the last time anyone had looked at him like that? As if he were a savior instead of a force to be navigated carefully. She did not let go of his hand. She simply turned and began walking, tugging him along with a confidence that belied her size. Clayton followed, leading justice by the reins with his free hand, feeling absurd and strangely moved in equal measure. They walked down the main street, past the watching eyes and silent witnesses. No one spoke. No one offered explanation or warning. They simply watched Clayton Mercer, the most powerful man in 3 counties, being led away by a barefoot child in rags. The girl turned at the end of the street, heading toward the edge of town, where the buildings grew more scattered and shabby. This was where Red Creek's poorest residents lived, those who existed on the margins of the town's economy. Day laborers, drifters, widows, with no family support. Clayton had been aware of this area. In the abstract way, he was aware of most things that did not directly impact his business. He had never actually walked these streets. The houses, if they could be called that, were little more than shacks. Weathered wood, gaps in the walls, roofs that would leak in the first good rain. Laundry hung between buildings, faded clothes that had been mended so many times the original fabric was barely visible. A few scraggly chickens pecked at the dirt. A thin dog watched them pass with wary eyes. The girl led him past these dwellings to the very last structure, set apart from the others as if even poverty had hierarchies. It was smaller than the rest, leaning slightly to one side like it might collapse from exhaustion. The wood was grey with age and weather, the windows covered with cloth instead of glass, and the front door hung at an angle, one hinge broken, the wood splintered and worn. It represented everything Clayton's life was not: instability, failure, the kind of poverty that ground people down until they simply ceased trying. The girl stopped in front of this door and finally released his hand. She looked up at him with those ancient eyes, and Clayton understood that whatever lay beyond that broken door would change him. He could feel it the way you feel a storm coming, a pressure in the air that speaks of transformation whether you want it or not. "My mama's inside," the girl whispered. "She's been waiting." Clayton tied Justice's reins to a post that looked barely sturdy enough to hold the animal. The horse nickered softly, sensing his unease. Or perhaps sensing something else, something Clayton's rational mind refused to acknowledge. Animals often knew things before humans did. The girl pushed at the broken door carefully, knowing exactly how much pressure to apply, where to push to make it swing inward without falling off its remaining hinge. This was practiced knowledge, the kind that came from repetition and necessity. How many times had she entered this way, careful not to break the last thing holding the door in place? Inside, the dimness was profound after the brilliant Texas sunlight. Clayton's eyes struggled to adjust as he stepped across the threshold, his boots loud on the bare wooden floor. The air was thick with heat and something else: sickness. He recognized that smell from when his father had died, a sweetish, heavy odor that spoke of bodies failing despite the spirit's determination. The single room that served as the shack's main living space contained almost nothing: a rough table with one chair, a pot-bellied stove that looked like it had not been used in months, despite the heat requiring no fire for cooking, a few dishes, chipped and mismatched, no curtains, no decorations, no evidence of the small comforts that even poor families usually managed. This was not poverty. This was destitution. "Sarah, is that you?" The voice came from beyond a thin partition that separated the main room from what must have been a bedroom. It was a woman's voice, weak and strained, each word clearly costing effort. "Yes, Mama," the girl replied, her voice suddenly small and young in a way it had not been on the street. "I brought him, like you said." Clayton felt his jaw tighten. Like you said. This had been planned then. The woman had sent the child to find him specifically. But why? He did not know anyone in this part of town. He made a point of not knowing these people, not out of cruelty but simple practicality. You could not help everyone, and trying only made you vulnerable to manipulation. The girl, Sarah, apparently, gestured toward the partition. "She's in there. She's real sick." Clayton wanted to leave. Every instinct screamed at him to turn around, mount justice and ride back to the clean simplicity of his ranch. This was not his problem. This was not his responsibility. He had built his entire life on clear boundaries between what was his concern and what was not. But he had followed the child this far, and something in that torn blue ribbon she still clutched, something in her desperate eyes kept him rooted in place. He moved toward the partition, ducking slightly to pass through the narrow opening. The bedroom beyond was even smaller than the main room, barely large enough for the narrow bed, pushed against one wall. On that bed lay a woman who might have been 30 or might have been 50. Illness had a way of erasing age, leaving only suffering. She was thin, painfully so, her cheekbones sharp beneath pale skin. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, and her breathing was labored, each inhale a visible effort. But when she turned her head to look at him, Clayton saw intelligence in her gaze, a fierce awareness that sickness had not yet conquered. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and somehow she managed to make it sound formal despite her condition. "Thank you for coming. I know this is unexpected." Clayton found his voice, though it came out harder than he intended. "You know who I am. Everyone knows who you are, Mr. Mercer." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "You're the richest man in the territory. You own half of Red Creek, and you're the only person who might remember me." Clayton studied her face, searching for recognition and finding none. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met." "Not in many years," she admitted. "I was Rebecca Hartley then. I taught school in Red Creek, back when there was still a school. That would have been 20 years ago, before the drought killed the funding and most families left." Rebecca Hartley, the name stirred something in Clayton's memory, vague and distant. There had been a school teacher, he recalled now, a young woman newly arrived from somewhere back east, Philadelphia, perhaps? He had met her once or twice at town gatherings he had been obligated to attend. She had been pretty, he remembered, with an earnest quality that seemed out of place on the harsh frontier. "I remember," he said slowly. "You left town after a few years." "I did." She closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I should have left sooner, but I stayed for a reason. A good reason." Sarah had followed Clayton into the room, and now stood at the foot of her mother's bed, clutching the blue ribbon like a lifeline. Rebecca reached out a trembling hand toward her daughter, and Sarah took it immediately, the connection between them palpable, despite the child's youth. "Sarah, sweetheart," Rebecca said gently, "would you get Mr. Mercer some water? There's a bucket by the door." The girl hesitated, clearly unwilling to leave her mother's side, but obedience won out. She released her mother's hand and slipped past Clayton, her bare feet silent on the floor. Once Sarah was out of earshot, Rebecca's expression changed, becoming more urgent. "I don't have much time, Mr. Mercer. The doctor has been clear about that." Consumption doesn't forgive, and I've had it for nearly a year now. Consumption, tuberculosis. Clayton had known others who had died from it, had seen how it consumed people from the inside until nothing remained but death. There was no cure, no hope once it took hold. Rebecca Hartley was dying, and she knew it with the clarity of someone who had already made peace with the fact. "I'm sorry," Clayton said, and was surprised to find he meant it. "But I still don't understand why you sent your daughter to bring me here." "Because you're the only family she has left," Rebecca said simply. The words made no sense. Clayton had no children. His brief marriage had produced no offspring, and he had never strayed from his marital vows, despite his wife's absence. He had no illegitimate children, no secret heirs. His only blood relative had been Thomas, and Thomas was 15 years dead. "Mrs. Hartley," he said carefully, "I think you're mistaken. I have no connection to your daughter." "Not to Sarah directly," Rebecca agreed, "but you had a brother, Thomas Mercer." The name hit Clayton like a physical blow. He had not heard anyone speak Thomas's name aloud in years. After his brother's death, it had become an unspoken rule among the ranch staff and townspeople. They knew better than to mention Thomas in Clayton's presence. "What does Thomas have to do with this?" His voice came out rougher than intended, almost a growl. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, though whether from pain or emotion, Clayton could not tell. "Everything, Mr. Mercer. Thomas has everything to do with this. He was Sarah's father." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Clayton gripped the doorframe to steady himself, his mind refusing to process what he had just heard. Thomas had no children. Thomas had died at 27, unmarried, with no attachments that Clayton knew of. If Thomas had fathered a child, Clayton would have known, wouldn't he? "That's impossible," he said flatly. "Thomas never mentioned a child. He never mentioned you." "No," Rebecca whispered. "He wouldn't have. We kept our relationship secret. We were engaged, Mr. Mercer. Thomas and I planned to marry." Clayton studied her face, searching for recognition and finding none. "I'm sorry, but I don't believe we've met." "Not in many years," she admitted. "I was Rebecca Hartley then. I taught school in Red Creek, back when there was still a school. That would have been 20 years ago, before the drought killed the funding and most families left." Rebecca Hartley. The name stirred something in Clayton's memory, vague and distant. There had been a school teacher, he recalled now, a young woman, newly arrived from somewhere back east, Philadelphia, perhaps. He had met her once or twice at town gatherings he had been obligated to attend. She had been pretty, he remembered, with an earnest quality that seemed out of place on the harsh frontier. "I remember," he said slowly. "You left town after a few years." "I did," she closed her eyes briefly, gathering strength. "I should have left sooner, but I stayed for a reason, a good reason." Sarah had followed Clayton into the room, and now stood at the foot of her mother's bed, clutching the blue ribbon like a lifeline. Rebecca reached out a trembling hand toward her daughter, and Sarah took it immediately, the connection between them palpable, despite the child's youth. "Sarah, sweetheart," Rebecca said gently, "would you get Mr. Mercer some water? There's a bucket by the door." The girl hesitated, clearly unwilling to leave her mother's side, but obedience won out. She released her mother's hand and slipped past Clayton, her bare feet silent on the floor. Once Sarah was out of earshot, Rebecca's expression changed, becoming more urgent. "I don't have much time, Mr. Mercer. The doctor has been clear about that. Consumption doesn't forgive, and I've had it for nearly a year now. Consumption, tuberculosis." Clayton had known others who had died from it, had seen how it consumed people from the inside until nothing remained but death. There was no cure, no hope once it took hold. Rebecca Hartley was dying, and she knew it with the clarity of someone who had already made peace with the fact. "I'm sorry," Clayton said, and was surprised to find he meant it. But I still don't understand why you sent your daughter to bring me here. Because you're the only family she has left, Rebecca said simply. The words made no sense. Clayton had no children. His brief marriage had produced no offspring, and he had never strayed from his marital vows despite his wife's absence. He had no illegitimate children, no secret heirs. His only blood relative had been Thomas, and Thomas was 15 years dead. Mrs. Hartley, he said carefully, I think you're mistaken. I have no connection to your daughter. Not to Sarah directly, Rebecca agreed. But you had a brother, Thomas Mercer. The name hit Clayton like a physical blow. He had not heard anyone speak Thomas's name aloud in years. After his brother's death, it had become an unspoken rule among the ranch staff and townspeople. They knew better than to mention Thomas in Clayton's presence. What does Thomas have to do with this? His voice came out rougher than intended, almost a growl. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, though whether from pain or emotion, Clayton could not tell. Everything, Mr. Mercer. Thomas has everything to do with this. He was Sarah's father. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Clayton gripped the doorframe to steady himself, his mind refusing to process what he had just heard. Thomas had no children. Thomas had died at 27, unmarried, with no attachments that Clayton knew of. If Thomas had fathered a child, Clayton would have known. Wouldn't he? That's impossible, he said flatly. Thomas never mentioned a child. He never mentioned you. No, Rebecca whispered. He wouldn't have. We kept our relationship secret. We were engaged. Mr. Mercer, Thomas and I planned to marry. Clayton's mind raced backward through memories he had kept carefully contained for 15 years. Thomas at 27, working the ranch, laughing with the hands, always seeming lighter somehow than Clayton's constant burden of responsibility. Had there been signs, absences, Clayton had not questioned, a happiness in Thomas that went beyond simple contentment. Why secret? Clayton demanded. Why would Thomas hide an engagement from him? Rebecca's expression held understanding mixed with reproach. Because he knew you, Mr. Mercer. He knew how you would react. You were building your empire, every waking moment devoted to expansion and profit. Thomas told me you had forgotten what it meant to live for anything beyond the ranch. The words stung because they carried truth. Clayton had been consumed by ambition in those days, driven to prove that the Mercer name meant something, that his father's struggles had not been in vain. He had pushed Thomas hard, expected him to match Clayton's own relentless pace. Thomas wanted to wait until the time was right. Rebecca continued, her breathing growing more labored. He was going to tell you. He had it all planned. He was going to ask for a small piece of land on the eastern edge of your property, somewhere we could build a home. He thought if he approached you with a solid plan, showed you how it would not interfere with ranch operations, you might understand. Sarah returned with a tin cup of water, offering it to Clayton with careful formality. He took it automatically, though he had no intention of drinking. The girl resumed her position at her mother's bedside, and Rebecca touched her hair with tender fingers. But then the accident happened. Rebecca said softly, Thomas died before he could tell you about us, about the baby I was carrying. And I was terrified, Mr. Mercer. I was alone, pregnant, and convinced that the same ranch that killed Thomas might somehow threaten my child. That's absurd, Clayton said sharply. It was an accident. Equipment failure. Was it? Rebecca met his eyes steadily. Thomas was the most careful man I ever knew. He checked every piece of equipment twice. He never worked alone in dangerous situations. But that day, he was alone, using machinery that supposedly failed. Did you ever question that, Mr. Mercer? Clayton had not. He had been too devastated, too consumed by grief and guilt to investigate beyond the official explanation. Equipment failed sometimes. The frontier was dangerous. These were accepted truths, and Clayton had accepted them because questioning meant diving deeper into pain he could barely survive. I left Red Creek right after the funeral, Rebecca said. I moved to Austin, had Sarah there. I tried to build a life for us. I worked as a seamstress, then a laundress, but the consumption started 2 years ago, and work became impossible. I came back here because living was cheaper, and I thought perhaps if I died near where Thomas lived, some part of him might still be here. She coughed then, a deep, rattling sound that shook her entire frame. Sarah immediately reached for a cloth beside the bed, holding it to her mother's mouth with practiced efficiency. When Rebecca pulled it away, Clayton saw the dark stains, blood. Not much, but enough to confirm what he already knew. Rebecca Hartley was dying, and soon. "I don't have weeks, Mr. Mercer," Rebecca said when she could speak again. "I have days, maybe less, and Sarah has no one, no family that will claim her. She'll end up in an orphanage if she's lucky, on the streets if she's not. Unless you help." Clayton looked at the child, really looked at her for the first time. The dark hair, the shape of her eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. And yes, now that he knew to look for it, he could see Thomas in her features. The resemblance was there, subtle but unmistakable. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer, and recoiled from it. Rebecca Hartley's eyes held his with fierce determination. "I'm asking you to take her, raise her, give her the life Thomas would have wanted for his daughter. I'm asking you to be the family she deserves." The silence that followed Rebecca's request seemed to expand, filling the small room, until Clayton felt suffocated by it. Take the child, raise her, become responsible for another human being in ways that went far beyond the transactional relationships he had carefully cultivated his adult life. "I can't," he said finally, the words emerging harder than he intended. "Mrs. Hartley, I'm not suited for this. I live alone. I work from dawn until dark. I have no experience with children, no understanding of what they need." "You raised Thomas," Rebecca countered weakly. "I kept Thomas alive and taught him to work," Clayton corrected. "That's not the same as being a father, and I clearly failed at knowing him if he felt he had to hide his entire life from me." Rebecca's expression softened with something that might have been pity. "Thomas loved you, Mr. Mercer. He talked about you constantly, about how hard you worked, how much you sacrificed for the ranch, for him. But he was also lonely, living in the shadow of someone who had forgotten how to be human beyond work and duty." The assessment cut deeper than Clayton wanted to admit. He looked at Sarah, who stood motionless beside her mother's bed, her face carefully blank in the way children learned when they had been disappointed too many times to show hope. "I can provide financially," Clayton offered, grasping for a solution that fit within his understanding of problems and solutions. "I'll pay for a good boarding school, somewhere back east, where she'll receive proper education, proper care. I'll ensure she wants for nothing, except family," Rebecca said. "Except love. Except the knowledge that someone in this world sees her as more than an obligation to be managed with money." "Money solves problems," Clayton insisted. "It provides opportunities, security, a future. That's more than most children have." "It's not what Thomas would have wanted." Rebecca's voice was fading now, the conversation draining her remaining strength. "He would have wanted his daughter to know she was loved, that she belonged somewhere. He would have wanted her to have what he lost when your father died, and you stopped being a brother, and became only a boss." The words landed like physical blows. Clayton's hands clenched at his sides, anger rising to meet the guilt that Rebecca's assessment provoked. How dare this dying woman, this stranger who had kept Thomas's child secret for 7 years, presume to judge him, to tell him he had failed his brother, when he had given everything to build something lasting. Sarah's small voice cut through his anger. "I can work. I won't be trouble." Both adults turned to look at her. The child's face was solemn, her dark eyes far too old for 7 years. She still held that torn blue ribbon, and Clayton suddenly wondered about its significance, why she clutched it like a sacred object. "I'm strong," Sarah continued in that careful, measured tone. "I can clean and cook some. Mama taught me. I don't eat much. I could help with chores, maybe. I wouldn't be in the way." The offer, so practical and heartbreaking, silenced Clayton completely. This child, barely tall enough to reach a table, was negotiating her own worth in terms of labor and minimal needs. She was selling herself to him like a piece of livestock, trying to make herself acceptable, useful, worth the burden of keeping. Rebecca made a sound somewhere between a sob and a cough. "Sarah, baby, no, that's not what I meant." But Sarah pressed on, her eyes fixed on Clayton, with desperate intensity. "The ribbon was my papa's. Mama said he gave it to her when he said he loved her. She said he was good and kind and strong. She said he would have wanted me, maybe you could want me too, if I'm useful enough." Clayton felt something crack inside his chest, a fissure in the stone wall he had built around his heart 15 years ago. He turned away abruptly, unable to bear the weight of that desperate hope in Sarah's eyes. His gaze landed on an object sitting on a small shelf, barely visible in the dim light. A photograph in a simple tin frame, the kind that traveling photographers sold for a few cents. Clayton crossed the small room in 2 strides and picked up the frame. The tintype showed a young woman, recognizable as a healthier Rebecca, standing beside a young man. The man's face made Clayton's breath catch. Thomas, younger, perhaps 25, with that smile Clayton had almost forgotten, the smile that lit up his whole face, that made people want to be near him. Thomas had his arm around Rebecca's shoulders, and both of them looked at the camera with joy, so pure it radiated from the faded image. This was not a formal portrait. This was love, captured and preserved in silver and glass. "When was this taken?" Clayton's voice came out rough. "About 4 months before he died," Rebecca answered. "We went to Austin for the day. Thomas said he wanted something to remember the moment he knew he would be happy forever." Clayton traced his brother's face with one finger, the glass cooled beneath his touch. Thomas had been happy, truly deeply happy in a way Clayton had never achieved, never even attempted, and Clayton had known nothing about it, had been so absorbed in land acquisitions and cattle prices that his own brother's joy had passed completely unnoticed. "I need time," Clayton said, still staring at the photograph. "I need to think about this." "Time is something I don't have to give you," Rebecca replied. "Neither does Sarah." "Mr. Mercer, I know I'm asking something enormous. I know you've built a life that has no room for a child, especially one who reminds you of losses you've spent 15 years trying to forget. But she's Thomas's daughter. She's your blood. And whether you take her or not, you'll have to live with that choice for the rest of your life." Clayton set the photograph down with careful precision, as if its placement mattered deeply. His mind raced through calculations, trying to apply logic to a situation that defied rational analysis. Taking Sarah meant disrupting everything. It meant making room in his life, his home, his carefully controlled existence for chaos and need and emotional vulnerability. But refusing meant abandoning his brother's child to an uncertain fate. It meant failing Thomas again, even more completely than he had failed him in life. "I'll return tomorrow," he said finally, "with supplies, food, medicine, whatever you need, and I'll speak with Dr. Harrison about your care." "I don't want charity," Rebecca said firmly, despite her weakness. "I want a promise. Tell me you'll take Sarah, or tell me you won't. But don't leave us hanging in uncertainty while you try to find some compromise that lets you feel better about abandoning her." The bluntness was startling, almost offensive, but it was also honest in a way Clayton rarely experienced. People did not speak to him this way. They deferred, they maneuvered, they told him what they thought he wanted to hear. Rebecca Hartley was dying and had nothing left to lose, which made her perhaps the most honest person Clayton had encountered in decades. "Tomorrow," he repeated, "I promise I'll give you an answer tomorrow." Rebecca studied him for a long moment, then nodded slightly. "Then I'll be here tomorrow, God willing." Sarah had not moved throughout the entire conversation, still clutching her ribbon, still wearing that expression of careful blankness. But as Clayton moved toward the door, she spoke again. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Mercer. Mama said you might not. She said important people don't usually come when poor people ask. Clayton stopped at the threshold, his hand on the splintered doorframe. He looked back at the child, at this small person who had somehow upended his entire world in less than an hour. Your mama was wrong about one thing, he said quietly. You asked, and I came. It was a small concession, barely an acknowledgement, but Sarah's expression shifted slightly, a fraction of hope breaking through the carefully maintained mask. Clayton fled that hope, walking quickly through the main room and out into the blinding sunlight. The ride back to the ranch passed in a blur of heat and dust, and thoughts that refused to organize themselves into anything coherent. Justice seemed to sense his rider's distraction, picking his way along the familiar trail with minimal guidance. Clayton barely noticed the landscape, barely registered the hours passing as the sun tracked across the sky. His mind kept returning to that photograph. Thomas's smile, Rebecca's joy, the evidence of a whole life his brother had lived in secret, parallel to the one Clayton thought he knew. How had he missed it? How had he been so consumed by his own ambitions that his brother's happiness escaped his notice entirely? By the time Clayton reached the ranch, the sun was lowering toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. The main house rose before him, grand and imposing, a testament to everything he had built. 3 stories of whitewashed wood and stone, with a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides, windows that gleamed with real glass, imported at considerable expense. A home built to impress, to demonstrate success, to stand as a monument to the Mercer name. A home that echoed with emptiness every single day. Dutch met him at the stable, his weathered face creasing with concern. Boss, everything all right? You've been gone since morning and you look like you've seen a ghost. Clayton dismounted slowly, his body stiff from hours in the saddle and the tension that had not released since he left that shack. He handed the reins to Dutch, who took them with the easy competence of a man who had worked horses his entire life. Dutch, did Thomas ever talk to you? About personal matters, I mean. About anything beyond ranch work? Dutch's eyebrows rose in surprise. Clayton never discussed Thomas, not in 15 years. The question clearly caught the foreman off guard. Sometimes, Dutch said carefully, he was friendlier than you, if you'll pardon my saying so. Liked to talk while we worked. Why do you ask? Did he ever mention a woman? Someone he was courting? Dutch's expression shifted, becoming thoughtful. There was a time, maybe a year before he died, when Thomas seemed different. Happier. He'd ride into town more often, always had some errand that needed doing, and he whistled while he worked, which he'd never done before. I figured he'd met someone, but he never said, and I didn't ask. Wasn't my business. So, there had been signs. People had noticed, and Clayton, absorbed in his ledgers and expansion plans, had missed them entirely. Or perhaps he had simply not cared enough to look. There's a situation in town, Clayton said slowly. A complicated situation involving Thomas. I need to think some things through. Dutch nodded, accepting this vague explanation with his usual discretion. If you need to talk it through, boss, I'm here. Sometimes thinking out loud helps. Clayton almost declined automatically. He had spent 15 years not talking about anything that mattered, keeping his thoughts locked away where they could not make him vulnerable. But standing here in the fading light, with the weight of Rebecca's dying request pressing down on him, he found the words emerging despite his usual guardedness. Thomas had a daughter, a 7-year-old girl. Her mother is dying, and she wants me to take the child. Dutch went very still, his hands pausing in their work of removing Justice's saddle. Then, slowly, he turned to face Clayton fully. Thomas had a daughter? You're certain? I saw a photograph. The resemblance is clear. And the mother, Rebecca Hartley, she has no reason to lie. She's dying of consumption and has nothing to gain from fabricating this story. Rebecca Hartley, Dutch repeated thoughtfully. The schoolteacher. I remember her. Pretty woman, kind. Left town sudden-like after Thomas died. We all wondered why, but figured it wasn't our concern. She was pregnant when she left, Clayton said. Pregnant with Thomas's child, and too afraid to tell me. Dutch absorbed this information with the calm of a man who had lived long enough to be surprised by very little. Afraid of you? Why? Because she knew what I had become, Clayton said quietly. What I still am. A man who measures everything in terms of profit and loss, who has no room in his life for anything that cannot be calculated or controlled. Dutch finished removing the saddle, setting it aside with careful precision before responding. So what are you going to do? I don't know, Clayton admitted. The logical choice is to provide financially. Set up a trust, pay for boarding school, ensure she has opportunities. That's what I do. I solve problems with resources. But, Dutch prompted, but the mother wants more than money. She wants me to raise the child, to be family. And I have no idea how to do that. I barely managed to keep Thomas alive, and I clearly failed at knowing him. What business do I have trying to raise his daughter? Dutch was quiet for a moment, leading Justice to his stall and beginning the evening care routine. Clayton found himself following something he rarely did. Usually he left horse care to Dutch, and the hands considering it beneath his attention. But tonight he needed the simple, physical work. You know I was orphaned, Dutch said finally, not looking at Clayton as he worked. I was about 10 when my folks died. Cholera took them both within a week, left me and my sister with nothing. Clayton stopped, surprised. I knew you came to work for my father young, but I didn't know the circumstances. Your father found me trying to steal a chicken from his coop, Dutch continued. I was starving, desperate, ready to do anything to survive. He could have had me arrested, thrown in jail, or shipped off to an orphanage. Instead, he gave me a job, a place to sleep, and food to eat. Said every boy deserved a chance to make something of himself. Dutch turned now, meeting Clayton's eyes directly. Your father wasn't perfect. He struggled with the ranch, made mistakes, left you with debt when he died. But he knew something you seem to have forgotten. People aren't problems to be solved with money. They're not investments that need to show return. Sometimes the most important thing you can give someone is the knowledge that they matter, that they're not alone in this world. The words hit Clayton harder than he expected. His father had taken in Dutch, had given an orphaned boy more than wages. He had given him belonging, purpose, a place in the world. And Clayton had benefited from that decision. Dutch had been with the Mercer ranch for 40 years now, loyal and capable, more valuable than any paid employee could be. Because he had not been treated as an employee, he had been treated as family. Thomas's daughter offered to work for her keep, Clayton said quietly. A 7-year-old child, trying to make herself useful enough to deserve basic care. She thinks her worth has to be earned. Does it? Dutch asked simply. The question hung in the evening air, challenging everything Clayton believed about value and worth, and the fundamental nature of human relationships. Did worth have to be earned? Was that how he measured everyone, including himself? Had he spent his entire adult life trying to earn a value that should have simply existed by virtue of being human? I need to check something, Clayton said suddenly, turning toward the house. There's a safe in my study. Thomas's belongings are there. Dutch nodded, understanding. I'll finish up here. Take your time, boss. Clayton walked to the house with purposeful strides, his mind racing ahead. He had packed away Thomas's possessions after the funeral, unable to bear looking at them but equally unable to discard them. They had sat untouched in his safe for 15 years, a collection of artifacts from a life cut short. Maria met him at the door, her round face brightening at his return. Mr. Mercer, you're back. I kept dinner warm. Are you hungry? Not now, Maria. Thank you. She studied him with the perceptiveness of someone who had worked in his household for years. You look troubled. Is everything all right? I'm not certain, Clayton admitted. but I need to examine some old belongings. I'll let you know about dinner later." Maria nodded, accepting his dismissal with grace. Clayton climbed the stairs to his study, a room he had designed for functionality rather than comfort. A large desk dominated the space, covered with ledgers and correspondence. Behind it stood the safe, heavy and imposing, containing the ranch's important documents and valuables, and Thomas's pocket watch. Clayton worked the combination with steady hands, the familiar sequence of numbers opening the heavy door with a satisfying click. Inside, the safe held exactly what he expected: deeds to the ranch properties, stock certificates, a modest amount of cash for emergencies, and in the back corner, a small wooden box he had not opened in 15 years. He lifted the box carefully, surprised by how light it felt. Thomas's entire personal legacy, reduced to a container no larger than a shoebox. Clayton carried it to his desk, sat down, and for a long moment simply stared at it, his hands resting on the worn wood. Opening this box meant confronting memories he had spent 15 years avoiding. It meant facing the brother he had failed to know, the relationship he had taken for granted until it was too late. But Sarah's face kept appearing in his mind, those dark eyes so like Thomas's, that desperate hope barely contained behind careful blankness. Clayton opened the box. The pocket watch lay on top, its silver case tarnished, but still intact. Clayton picked it up, feeling the weight of it, the smoothness of the metal worn by Thomas's hands. He pressed the catch, and the cover sprang open to reveal the face. The hands had stopped at 2:30, frozen at the moment Thomas died or shortly after. But it was the inscription on the inside of the cover that made Clayton's breath catch. He had forgotten about the inscription, had perhaps never really looked at it close. The words were engraved in elegant script: "To my brother, who taught me to stand tall. T.M." Clayton had given Thomas this watch for his 21st birthday. He remembered now, remembered saving for months, to afford something worthy, something that would mark Thomas's transition to manhood. He had presented it awkwardly, uncomfortable with sentiment even then, and Thomas had been overjoyed, had worn it every single day for the remaining 6 years of his life. "Who taught me to stand tall." Thomas had seen Clayton as someone to admire, someone worth emulating. And how had Clayton responded to that trust? By becoming so absorbed in building an empire that he never noticed his brother falling in love, planning a future, preparing to become a father. Clayton set the watch aside with trembling hands and explored the rest of the box's contents. A few letters from their father, written before his death. A photograph of their parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful. A small, leather journal, its pages filled with Thomas's distinctive handwriting. Clayton picked up the journal with growing dread. This was Thomas's private thoughts, meant for no eyes but his own. Reading it felt like a violation. But if there were answers here, information about Rebecca, about Sarah, about the life Thomas had hidden, then Clayton needed to know. He opened to the first page, dated 5 years before Thomas's death. The entries were sporadic, irregular, the musings of someone who wrote when moved to do so, rather than from discipline. Clayton skipped forward, looking for entries from the final year of Thomas's life. There, the handwriting changed slightly as Thomas matured, became more confident, and the content shifted from observations about ranch work to something more personal. "Met a woman today, Rebecca Hartley, the new school teacher. She has kind eyes and a laugh that makes me think maybe there's more to life than cattle and dust. Clayton would probably tell me I'm being foolish, that romance is a distraction from building something lasting. But maybe he's wrong. Maybe building something lasting means more than just accumulating land." Clayton's jaw tightened. Even in his private journal, Thomas had predicted Clayton's reaction, had known his brother would dismiss love as impractical. How had Clayton become so predictable in his coldness that even Thomas could anticipate his disapproval? He read on, page after page of Thomas falling in love. The entries grew more frequent, more detailed. Thomas described walks with Rebecca, conversations about books and dreams and futures. He wrote about her intelligence, her courage in coming to the frontier alone, her belief that education could transform lives. And then, several months later, the entry Clayton both dreaded and needed to read. I'm going to marry her. I know it with absolute certainty. Rebecca Hartley will be my wife, and we'll build a life together. I need to tell Clayton, but I'm afraid. His brother had been afraid to share the most important news of his life, because he knew Clayton would not understand, would not approve, would see it as a distraction from building the Mercer empire. The realization sat in Clayton's stomach like a stone. He continued reading, each entry cutting deeper. Thomas wrote about asking Rebecca to marry him, about her joyful acceptance, about their secret meetings and careful planning. They had discussed everything: where they would live, how many children they wanted, what kind of life they hoped to build together. Thomas had drawn diagrams in the margins, sketching out plans for a small house on the eastern boundary of the ranch, far enough from the main operation to provide privacy, but close enough that he could still work alongside Clayton. Rebecca is with child, one entry read, dated 4 months before Thomas's death. I'm going to be a father. I've never been so terrified and excited at once. I have to tell Clayton now. He needs to know he's going to be an uncle. I think it might even soften him, make him remember that family means more than property lines and profit margins. But the next entry, written a week later, showed Thomas's resolve wavering. Clayton has been impossible lately. The drought has him worried about water rights, and he's negotiating to buy the Patterson property. He works 18-hour days and barely speaks, except to give orders. This isn't the right time. I'll wait until the deal is finished, until he's less stressed. Then I'll tell him everything. The Patterson property. Clayton remembered that acquisition clearly. It had been complicated, involving water rights and easements that required careful legal navigation. He had been obsessed with it, seeing it as crucial to the ranch's long-term viability. And Thomas had been trying to find a moment to share life-changing news, waiting for his brother to be less consumed by business. That moment never came. The journal entries grew darker as Thomas's frustration mounted. He wrote about feeling invisible, about working alongside Clayton every day while maintaining a secret that grew heavier with each passing week. He wrote about Rebecca's growing concern, her gentle questions about when they could stop hiding, when they could start their life together openly. I almost told him today, Thomas wrote 2 weeks before his death. We were riding the north fence line, and for a moment it felt like old times, like when we were younger, and would talk about more than just work. But then he started discussing expansion plans for next year, and I realized he wasn't really there with me. His body was on the horse beside mine, but his mind was already calculating costs and returns. I don't think I can reach him anymore. I don't think the brother who gave me that pocket watch exists anymore. Clayton's hands shook as he held the journal. Thomas had tried, had wanted to connect, to share, to bridge the distance Clayton had created. And Clayton had been too absorbed in his own ambitions to notice his brother's isolation. The final entries made Clayton's chest tighten, with a pain that felt physical. Thomas had made a decision. He was going to tell Clayton everything, whether the timing seemed right or not. Rebecca was 4 months pregnant, beginning to show, and they could not hide much longer. Thomas had planned it out carefully, rehearsing what he would say, how he would present it. Tomorrow, Thomas wrote in his last entry, I'm going to tell Clayton tomorrow. I've arranged to meet him in the north pasture after the morning work is done. Just the two of us, away from the ranch hands and distractions. I'll show him Rebecca's photograph, tell him about the baby, ask for his blessing. And if he can't give it, if he disapproves, then Rebecca and I will leave. We'll go to Austin or San Antonio, somewhere I can find work. I won't let Clayton's coldness poison our happiness. But I hope, I truly hope, that somewhere inside my brother still exists The man who cared about more than money and land. The entry ended there. The next day, Thomas had died in the north pasture, alone in an equipment accident that no one questioned, because accidents happened on ranches. They were part of life on the frontier, tragic, but inevitable. Clayton closed the journal and sat in silence as full darkness settled over the ranch. The lamp on his desk cast shadows that seemed to press in from all sides. His mind circled back to Rebecca's question, the one he had dismissed as grief-stricken paranoia. Was it an accident? Thomas had planned to meet him in the north pasture, but Clayton had never received that message, had been in town that day dealing with bank business. When he returned to the ranch that evening, Thomas was already dead. The hands told him there had been an accident, that the equipment had failed catastrophically. Clayton had been too devastated to investigate thoroughly. He accepted the explanation because questioning it meant confronting the possibility that Thomas's death could have been prevented. That if Clayton had been there, if he had been the kind of brother worth confiding in, Thomas might still be alive. Now, 15 years later, new questions emerged. Why had Thomas been alone? Who told him Clayton would meet him in the north pasture? And most troubling, why had Clayton never questioned these details before? A knock at the study door interrupted his dark thought. Maria entered carrying a tray with coffee and a plate of food. Clayton had not requested. She set it on the desk with the familiarity of 15 years' service. "You need to eat something," she said firmly. "You've been up here for hours, and you look like you've aged 10 years since this morning." Clayton gestured to the open journal, the scattered contents of Thomas's box. "Did you know about Thomas and the school teacher?" Maria's expression shifted, becoming carefully neutral. "I suspected. Thomas was happier that last year. He smiled more, whistled while he worked, and he went to town more often than ranch business required. Why didn't you say anything?" "It wasn't my place to speculate about Mr. Thomas's personal affairs," Maria said. "And you didn't encourage personal conversation, Mr. Mercer. You made it very clear that the household was to run efficiently and professionally." Another indictment, gently delivered. Clayton had created an environment where even kindly meant observations about his brother's happiness were unwelcome. "The school teacher had his child," Clayton said quietly. "A daughter. She's 7 years old now. The mother is dying, and she wants me to take the girl." Maria's hand went to her mouth, eyes widening. "Mr. Thomas had a daughter, and she's been living in poverty all this time while we—" She gestured around the grand study, unable to finish the sentence. "I didn't know," Clayton said, but the excuse sounded hollow, even to his own ears. He had not known because he had not looked, had not cared enough to investigate beyond the surface of his brother's life. "What are you going to do?" Maria asked, the same question Dutch had posed earlier. "I gave the mother my word. I'd have an answer tomorrow, but I don't know what that answer should be. Taking in a child, becoming responsible for raising her, it's not something I'm equipped to do." Maria studied him for a long moment, then spoke with unusual directness. "Mr. Mercer, you've spent 15 years turning this ranch into the most successful operation in 3 counties. You've overcome droughts, market collapses, competition from larger outfits. You've done things people said were impossible. And you're telling me you can't figure out how to care for one little girl." "Business is different," Clayton protested. "I understand profit and loss, risk and return. Children aren't transactions." "No, they're not," Maria agreed. "They're much more important than that. They're the only thing that actually matters when everything else is stripped away." Mr. Thomas understood that. He was building something that would outlast him, something more valuable than all this land and all these cattle. He was building a family. She moved toward the door, then paused. "That little girl is Mr. Thomas's legacy, the only part of him that survives. You have a choice, Mr. Mercer. You can honor your brother's memory by caring for his daughter, or you can let her become another thing you regret for the rest of your life. There won't be a third option." Maria left, closing the door quietly behind her. Clayton sat alone with Thomas's journal, the pocket watch, and the weight of 15 years of failures accumulating into a single moment of decision. Clayton did not sleep that night. He sat in his study, reading and rereading Thomas's journal, examining each entry for details he might have missed. The pocket watch sat on his desk, its stopped hands a constant reminder of time that could not be recovered, decisions that could not be unmade. As dawn broke over the ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Clayton made his decision, not the logical one his business mind insisted upon, not the safe choice that would preserve his comfortable isolation. He made the decision Thomas would have wanted him to make. He would take Sarah. The certainty of it settled over him like a physical weight, terrifying and strangely liberating at once. He had no idea how to be a father figure, no experience with children beyond his clumsy attempts at raising Thomas. He would probably make countless mistakes, fail in ways he could not even anticipate, but doing nothing, abandoning Thomas's daughter to an uncertain fate, was a failure he could not live with. Maria found him still at his desk when she came to prepare breakfast. She took one look at his face and smiled. The first genuine smile he had seen from her in years. "You're going to bring her home," she said, not a question but a statement of fact. "Yes," Clayton confirmed. "Today, but I'll need help, Maria. I don't know the first thing about caring for a child." "Then we'll learn together," Maria said simply. "The house has been too quiet for too long anyway. A child's laughter will do us all good." Clayton rode to Red Creek as the sun climbed higher, driving away the morning coolness. He carried with him Thomas's pocket watch and journal, tangible proof of the brother Sarah had never known. He also carried supplies, medicine for Rebecca's pain, food for both mother and daughter. Emmett Harrison was leaving the shack as Clayton arrived, his medical bag in hand, and his expression grave. "Mr. Mercer," the doctor said, surprise evident in his voice, "I didn't expect to see you here. I came to check on Mrs. Hartley," Clayton said. "How is she?" Harrison shook his head slowly. "Not well. The consumption has progressed rapidly. I've given her something for the pain, but there's little else I can do. She has perhaps a week, maybe less." Clayton felt a cold dread settle over him. He had promised Rebecca an answer, but he had assumed he would have time, days at least, to make arrangements to prepare. A week meant urgency, meant decisions had to be made and implemented immediately. "Does she know?" Clayton asked. "She knows," the doctor confirmed. "Mrs. Hartley is quite clear-headed about her situation. She's been asking for you since dawn." Clayton entered the shack without knocking, finding Sarah sitting on the floor in the main room. She had cleaned, he noticed. The few dishes were washed and stacked neatly. The floor had been swept. The child had tried to make her home presentable for his arrival. Another heartbreaking attempt to make herself acceptable. "Mr. Mercer," Sarah said, scrambling to her feet. She still wore the same ragged dress, still clutched that blue ribbon. "Mama's been waiting." "I know," Clayton said gently. "Your mama's friend, Dr. Harrison, told me. Is she awake?" Sarah nodded and led him to the bedroom. Rebecca lay propped on thin pillows, her face even more drawn than the previous day. But her eyes were alert, fixed on Clayton with fierce determination. "You came back," she whispered. "I gave you my word," Clayton replied, pulling the single chair close to her bedside. He set his packages aside and leaned forward, wanting her to hear him clearly. "Mrs. Hartley, Rebecca, I've spent the night thinking about what you asked, reading Thomas's journal, learning about the life he lived that I never knew about." Rebecca's hand moved weakly towards Sarah, who took it immediately. And you were right," Clayton said, the words coming easier than he expected, "about everything. I failed Thomas. I was so consumed with building an empire that I forgot what empires are supposed to be for. I forgot that family matters more than land, that love is worth more than any amount of money." Tears slipped down Rebecca's thin cheeks. "Does that mean—" "It means I'll take her," Clayton said firmly. "Sarah will come home with me today. She'll have everything she needs, Everything Thomas would have wanted for his daughter. You have my word on that. Rebecca's grip on Sarah's hand tightened despite her weakness. Relief flooded her wasted features, but also something else, gratitude mixed with sorrow, the bittersweet knowledge that her prayers had been answered even as her time ran out. Thank you, she breathed. Thank you for giving her what I couldn't. A home, a future, family. Sarah stood frozen beside the bed, her dark eyes moving between her mother and Clayton with an expression that broke his heart. She understood what was happening, understood that her mother's relief came at the cost of losing her. This child had already learned that every gain carried a loss, that survival required sacrificing something precious. Clayton reached into his pocket and withdrew Thomas's pocket watch. He held it out towards Sarah, who looked at it with confusion. This belonged to your father, Clayton said quietly. Thomas carried it every day for 6 years. I gave it to him when he turned 21, and he treasured it. Now it should belong to you. Sarah took the watch with trembling hands, cradling it like something holy. She traced the silver case with small fingers, and Clayton reached over to show her how to open it. See the inscription, he said. Your father wrote that. He looked up to me, though I didn't deserve it. He was a better man than I ever was. Kinder, gentler, more capable of love. Tell me about him, Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. Please. Mama tells me stories, but I want to know everything. So Clayton talked. He told Sarah about Thomas as a boy, about teaching him to ride, about how Thomas had been afraid of horses at first, but had overcome that fear through determination. He told her about Thomas's laugh, how it was infectious and could lift the spirits of everyone around him. He described how the ranch hands had loved Thomas, how even the hardest men softened in his presence. Rebecca listened with closed eyes, tears tracking down her cheeks, as Clayton painted a picture of the man she had loved, and Sarah absorbed every word, storing these memories like precious treasures, building an image of the father she would never meet. He had your eyes, Clayton said, looking at Sarah directly. The same dark brown, the same way of looking at people like you could see right through them, and he whistled while he worked. Always the same tune, though I never knew what it was called. I whistle sometimes, Sarah said softly. Mama says I sound just like him. Rebecca opened her eyes, focusing on Clayton with effort. There's something else you need to know, something I should have told you yesterday, but didn't have the strength. She paused, gathering herself. Thomas was investigating something before he died. Something about the ranch, about land deals that didn't seem right. Clayton went still. What do you mean you found documents? Rebecca continued, her voice fading. Papers that suggested some of your land acquisitions weren't legitimate. He was planning to talk to you about it, to give you a chance to make things right. He believed it was probably just your lawyer being dishonest without your knowledge. What lawyer? Clayton demanded, his mind racing. Marcus Flynn, Rebecca said. The man who handled your expansion deal. Thomas said Flynn had connections to some powerful people, people who might not appreciate questions being asked. Marcus Flynn, Clayton knew the name, knew the man. Flynn had indeed handled several property acquisitions during Clayton's most aggressive expansion period. But Clayton had moved away from using Flynn years ago, finding the man's methods questionable, even by frontier standards. Are you saying Thomas's accident might not have been an accident? Clayton's voice came out harsh, demanding. Rebecca's eyes met his with painful directness. I'm saying Thomas was careful. He checked equipment religiously. He never worked dangerous jobs alone, and the day he died, he was supposed to meet you, but somehow he ended up alone in that pasture, with faulty equipment. I've spent 7 years wondering if those things were coincidence or something worse. The room spun slightly as Clayton processed this information. 7 years Rebecca had carried this suspicion, too frightened and powerless to voice it, too aware that accusations against a man like Marcus Flynn could be dangerous for someone with no resources or protection. Clayton's hands clenched into fists. If Thomas had been murdered, if someone had killed his brother to cover up corruption, then Clayton's empire was built not just on his own ambition, but on blood. Thomas's blood. The thought made him physically ill. Did Thomas leave any evidence? Papers, documents, anything? Rebecca shook her head weakly. If he did, I never found them. He kept most things at the ranch, but he mentioned there were discrepancies in the land records, families that should have been compensated but weren't. He was trying to piece it together when he died. Clayton stood abruptly, pacing the small room like a caged animal. His mind raced through memories of those acquisition years, trying to recall details he had not thought about in over a decade. Flynn had been efficient, perhaps too efficient. Properties that should have taken months to acquire were settled in weeks. Clayton had been pleased by the speed, never questioning the methods, because the results served his ambitions. I need to look into this, Clayton said, but not now. Right now, what matters is you and Sarah. Rebecca smiled sadly. What matters is Sarah. I'm already gone, Mr. Mercer. I've made my peace with that. But promise me, if Thomas was killed, if someone murdered him to hide their crimes, you'll find out the truth. Don't let his death be for nothing. I promise, Clayton said, the words carrying the weight of an oath. If someone killed Thomas, they'll answer for it. Sarah had been silent through this exchange, clutching the pocket watch and watching the adults with those two old eyes. Now she spoke, her voice small but steady. Can I stay with Mama a little longer? Before I go? Clayton's throat tightened. Of course. Take all the time you need. He stepped out into the main room, giving them privacy for what might be their final hours together. Through the thin partition, he could hear Rebecca's weak voice, Sarah's quiet responses, a mother preparing her daughter for a future she would not see, imparting final wisdom, final love. Clayton examined the shack more carefully now, seeing details he had missed in his initial shock. A shelf held a few books, all well-worn from repeated reading. Sarah's makeshift bed in the corner, little more than a pile of cloth on the floor. A small collection of objects that must be treasures to the child. Smooth stones, a bird's feather, a button that caught the light, and on the shelf beside the books, partially hidden, was a cloth doll. Clayton picked it up carefully, marveling at the craftsmanship despite the crude materials. It was made from scraps of different fabrics, carefully stitched together, stuffed with what felt like dried grass. Someone had embroidered a face, simple but expressive. The doll wore a tiny dress made from the same blue fabric as Sarah's ribbon. This doll represented hours of work, creativity born from necessity, love expressed through whatever materials poverty allowed. Clayton held it gently, understanding that this object was worth more to Sarah than all the expensive toys his money could buy. He heard movement from the bedroom and quickly set the doll back in its place. Sarah emerged, her face composed but her eyes red from crying. She carried a small bundle, everything she owned wrapped in a single threadbare blanket. Mama says I should go now. Sarah said, she wants to rest, and she wants me to remember her awake. Not, she couldn't finish the sentence. Clayton knelt down, bringing himself to Sarah's eye level. Your mother is very brave and very wise. She loves you more than anything in this world. I know, Sarah whispered. She told me to be brave too, and to remember that Papa loved me even though he never got to meet me. Clayton stood and offered his hand. Sarah looked at it for a long moment, then shifted her bundle to one arm and placed her small hand in his. The gesture felt monumental, a bridge being built between two people who were strangers bound by blood and loss. We should say goodbye to your mother together, Clayton said gently. They returned to the bedroom. Rebecca had rallied slightly, her eyes clearer than they had been. She looked at her daughter and Clayton standing hand in hand, and something like peace crossed her face. Take care of each other, she said. That's what family does. Not because it's easy, but because it matters. Clayton made arrangements with Dr. Harrison to check on Rebecca daily and provide whatever comfort medicine could offer. He left money, though Rebecca protested weakly, insisting it was charity she did not want. Clayton countered that it was payment of a debt 15 years overdue, and she finally accepted. The ride back to the ranch felt surreal. Sarah sat in front of Clayton on justice, her small body rigid with fear and uncertainty. She had never been on a horse before, she admitted in a whisper, and Clayton adjusted his hold to make her feel more secure. "Your father loved horses," Clayton told her as they rode. "He had a gift with them. Even the most difficult animals would calm under his hands. I think you have that same gift. Justice likes you already." Sarah touched the horse's mane tentatively. "He's beautiful. I never seen anything so big up close." "You'll learn to ride," Clayton promised. "Dutch, my foreman, he's the best horseman I know. He'll teach you everything." They rode in silence for a while, the landscape rolling past in waves of brown grass and blue sky. Sarah gradually relaxed against Clayton's chest, exhaustion overtaking her fear. She had probably slept little the previous night, worried about her mother, uncertain about her future. "Mr. Mercer," Sarah's voice was barely audible over the horse's steady rhythm. "Yes. What should I call you?" The question caught Clayton unprepared. He had not thought that far ahead, had been so focused on making the decision to take her, that he had not considered the daily realities of their relationship. "What would you like to call me?" he asked. Sarah was quiet for a long moment. "Mama said you're my uncle, Papa's brother. Can I call you Uncle Clayton?" Something warm and painful bloomed in Clayton's chest. Uncle Clayton, not father, which would be presumptuous and impossible, not Mr. Mercer, which was too formal for family. But Uncle Clayton acknowledged their connection while respecting the boundaries of what they were to each other. "I'd like that," Clayton said, surprised by how much he meant it. The ranch came into view, sprawling and impressive in the afternoon sun. Sarah sat up straighter, staring at the main house with wide eyes. "You live there?" she asked, in disbelief. "We live there," Clayton corrected gently. "It's your home now, too." Maria was waiting on the porch, Dutch beside her. They had clearly been watching for Clayton's return. Maria's face softened when she saw the small figure seated in front of Clayton, and she descended the steps quickly. Clayton dismounted and lifted Sarah down. The child stood uncertainly, clutching her bundle and the pocket watch, overwhelmed by the size of everything. The house, the barn, the fences stretching into the distance. "Sarah," Clayton said, placing a hand on her shoulder. "This is Maria. She runs the household and takes care of everything. And this is Dutch, my foreman and the best friend I have, though I've probably never told him that." Dutch's weathered face crinkled into a genuine smile. "Welcome home, Miss Sarah. Your papa was a fine man. I'm honored to know his daughter." Sarah looked up at Dutch, then at Maria, searching their faces for signs of deception or cruelty. She had learned to be wary, to expect disappointment, but whatever she saw in their expressions must have reassured her, because she managed a small nod. "Hello," she whispered. Maria knelt down, bringing herself to Sarah's level much as Clayton had done earlier. "You must be exhausted, sweetheart. How about we get you cleaned up, find you some proper clothes, and then I'll make you something good to eat. Are you hungry?" Sarah nodded, and Maria stood, offering her hand. Sarah looked back at Clayton, seeking permission or reassurance. "Go ahead," Clayton said. "Maria will take good care of you. I need to talk with Dutch for a few minutes, and then I'll come find you." Sarah allowed Maria to lead her into the house, casting frequent glances back at Clayton, as if afraid he might disappear. Dutch watched them go, then turned to Clayton with raised eyebrows. "She's the image of Thomas," Dutch said quietly. "Same eyes, same way of holding herself. Anyone with eyes could see she's a Mercer." "Her mother is dying," Clayton said bluntly. "Consumption. She has days at most, and there's something else, Dutch. Something I need your help investigating." Dutch's expression grew serious. What is it? Thomas may have been murdered. Dutch's face went completely still, the way it did when he was processing something significant. Murdered? What makes you think that? Clayton told him everything. About Thomas's journal, about the land deals he had been investigating, about Marcus Flynn and the questions Thomas had been asking before his death. He described the inconsistencies that no one had questioned at the time, the convenient accidents that had removed an inconvenient witness. I was too destroyed by grief to see it, Clayton admitted. I accepted the official story because questioning it meant facing the possibility that I could have prevented it. But Rebecca planted the seed, and now that I've read Thomas's journal, I can't ignore it. Something wasn't right about that day. Dutch rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. Marcus Flynn, I remember him. Slick fellow, always wore fancy clothes and talked like a lawyer even when he wasn't in court. He stopped coming around, 10 years ago? About that, Clayton confirmed. I started using different legal counsel when I realized some of Flynn's methods were questionable. But by then, he had already handled a dozen major acquisitions for me. And you think Thomas found proof that those acquisitions were corrupt? I think Thomas found something that threatened powerful people, and I think they killed him to keep him quiet. Clayton's voice hardened with each word. I need to find out the truth, Dutch. I owe Thomas that much. But I also need to be careful. If there's a conspiracy that's been hidden for 15 years, the people responsible won't take kindly to questions. Dutch nodded slowly. What do you need from me? Information. Quietly. Talk to the old hands, the ones who were here when Thomas died. See if anyone remembers anything unusual about that day. Any visitors, any changes to Thomas's schedule, anything that seemed off at the time but was dismissed. I can do that, Dutch agreed. But boss, if you're right about this, if Thomas was murdered, then you're putting yourself in danger by investigating. These people, whoever they are, they've already killed once. Then they'll have to kill me too, Clayton said flat. Because I'm not stopping until I know what happened to my brother. Dutch studied him for a long moment, then gave a single nod. All right, I'll start asking around, but carefully. We don't want to spook anyone before we know what we're dealing with. Clayton gripped Dutch's shoulder briefly, a gesture of gratitude he rarely made. Then he turned toward the house, suddenly anxious to check on Sarah. He found Maria in the kitchen, preparing food, and she pointed upstairs. I drew her a bath and found some clothes that might work temporarily. They're too big, but we can take her to the dressmaker in town tomorrow. She's in the blue bedroom, the one with the window facing the garden. Clayton climbed the stairs, his boots loud on the polished wood. He had never been upstairs except to sleep in his own room at the far end of the hall. The blue bedroom had sat empty for years, waiting for guests who never came or children who were never born. He knocked softly on the door. Sarah, may I come in? A pause, then her small voice. Yes. Clayton entered to find Sarah standing in the middle of the room, dwarfed by its size. She wore one of Maria's old dresses, altered hastily with pins to keep it from dragging on the floor. Her hair was wet from the bath, combed smooth and hanging down her back. She looked terribly young and terribly lost in that large room with its fine furniture and soft bed. But she also looked different, clean, fed, no longer carrying the desperate edge of someone living on the knife's edge of survival. For the first time, Clayton could see what Sarah might become, given a chance. Not just Thomas's daughter, but her own person, with her own possibilities. Is this my room? Sarah asked, her voice small in the space. If you like it, Clayton said, or we can choose a different one. There are several empty rooms. Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the garden below, at the organized beauty Maria tended with such care. I can see flowers from here. Maria plants them every spring, Clayton explained. She says a house needs color to feel like a home. Sarah turned back to him, and Clayton saw tears tracking down her clean cheeks. It's too much. I don't deserve this. Clayton crossed the room and knelt beside her, something he was learning to do despite how unnatural it felt. You deserve this, and more. Your family, Sarah. You belong here. 3 days passed in a blur of adjustment and revelation. Sarah moved through the ranch house like a ghost, uncertain of her place, afraid to touch anything for fear of breaking it. Maria gently coaxed her toward normalcy, teaching her how things worked, showing her that she was allowed to exist in the space without earning it through labor. Clayton found himself watching the child constantly, studying her expressions, learning her habits. She woke before dawn, old patterns from poverty dying hard. She ate slowly, savoring every bite as if it might be her last meal, and she carried Thomas's pocket watch everywhere, checking it obsessively, though the hands never moved from 2:30. Dr. Harrison came on the third evening with news Clayton had been dreading. Rebecca Hartley had died that afternoon, quietly and with minimal suffering thanks to the medicine Clayton had provided. She had asked the doctor to tell Sarah that she loved her, that she was proud of her, and that she should be happy. Clayton delivered this news to Sarah in the library, a room lined with books he had collected but rarely read. The child received it with terrible stillness, her face going blank. In that way he was learning meant she was holding back overwhelming emotion. "Can we visit her grave?" Sarah asked finally, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "Of course," Clayton said. "We'll arrange a proper burial. Your mother deserves that. Next to my papa." The request hit Clayton hard. Rebecca and Thomas, together in death as they had wanted to be in life. "Yes, next to your papa, on the hill overlooking the ranch." Sarah nodded once, then turned and walked from the room with careful dignity. Clayton let her go, understanding that some grief needed privacy. Maria would check on her later, would offer the comfort of a woman's presence that Clayton could not provide. Alone in the library, Clayton returned to the task that had consumed his evening since bringing Sarah home. He had begun reviewing old documents, searching for the land deals Thomas had questioned. It was tedious work, made more difficult by the passage of 15 years and his own lack of detailed memory about transactions he had considered routine. But patterns were emerging. Properties acquired through Marcus Flynn all shared certain characteristics. The previous owners were always vulnerable, widows or families in financial distress. The sales were always quick, prices lower than market value, and in several cases, the families had simply disappeared after the transactions, moving away without leaving forwarding information. Clayton had assumed this was normal frontier migration. People came and went constantly, seeking better opportunities or fleeing bad luck. Now, he wondered if their departures had been less voluntary than he had believed. A knock at the library door interrupted his dark thoughts. Dutch entered, his expression grim. "Found something, boss. You're not going to like it." Clayton gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Tell me." "I talked to Joe Martinez, the old hand who retired 5 years back. He remembered the day Thomas died, said there was a visitor that morning, a man who came asking for you. When you weren't here, he said he'd wait up at the north pasture, that you'd know where to find him." Clayton's pulse quickened. "Did Joe describe this man?" "Fancy dresser," Joe said. "City clothes, talked smooth and carried himself like someone important." Dutch paused. "Sounds like Marcus Flynn to me. Flynn sent Thomas to the north pasture," Clayton said slowly, the pieces falling into place. "Thomas thought he was meeting me. Instead, he met sabotaged equipment and a lonely death." "There's more," Dutch continued. "I also talked to Ben Cooper, the hand who found Thomas. He's been drinking heavy for 15 years, couldn't seem to hold a job after leaving here. I always thought it was just the trauma of finding the body. But when I asked him about that day, he broke down, said he's been carrying guilt all this time." "Guilt about what?" "About not speaking up. Ben said the equipment that killed Thomas had been inspected the day before. He did the inspection himself, and everything was fine. But when the marshal investigated, suddenly there were maintenance logs showing that equipment hadn't been serviced in months. Ben said those logs were fake, but he was too scared to contradict them." Clayton felt rage rising in him, hot and dangerous. Someone forged maintenance logs to cover up murder, and Ben said nothing for 15 years. He was threatened, Dutch said quietly. 2 days after Thomas died, Ben got a visit from some men he didn't recognize. They told him accidents happen all the time on ranches, especially to people who talk too much. They gave him money to leave and never come back. He took it, boss. He was terrified, and he took the money and ran. Where is he now? Still in town, working odd jobs and drinking away his guilt. He wants to make it right, says he'll testify if you need him to. But he's scared, Clayton. Real scared. Says the men who threatened him weren't the kind to forget. Clayton stood and moved to the window, looking out at the dark landscape of his ranch. His empire, built on corruption and sealed with his brother's blood. The knowledge sat in his gut like poison. Marcus Flynn didn't do this alone, Clayton said. He's a lawyer, not a killer. Someone hired him, paid him to arrange those land deals and eliminate anyone who asked questions. Question is who? Dutch replied. Flynn handled deals for half the big ranchers in the territory. Could be any of them. Clayton's mind raced through possibilities, then stopped on one name that made terrible sense. Silas Crow. Dutch straightened in his chair. Crow? You're sure? Think about it, Clayton said, turning back to face his foreman. Crow's spread borders mine on 3 sides. He's been trying to expand for years, always pushing at my boundaries. And Marcus Flynn is married to Crow's sister. I remember that now. Flynn and Crow are family. That's a connection, Dutch admitted. But it's not proof. No, Clayton agreed. But it's a place to start. If Flynn arranged the land deals, he kept records. Lawyers always keep records, and if those records exist, they'll lead back to whoever paid him. I'm betting that's Silas Crow. Dutch looked troubled. Boss, if you're right, if Crow was behind Thomas's murder, then he's not going to sit idle while you investigate. He's powerful, connected, and clearly willing to kill to protect his interests. Then I'll need to move carefully, Clayton said. But I'm not backing down, Dutch. Thomas deserves justice. And all those families that lost their land to corrupt deals, they deserve to know the truth. A soft sound from the doorway made both men turn. Sarah stood there in her oversized nightgown, clutching her cloth doll. Her feet were bare, and her eyes were red from crying. I heard talking, she said quietly. I couldn't sleep. Clayton crossed to her immediately, kneeling down. I'm sorry we woke you. Dutch and I were just discussing some ranch business. But Sarah's eyes were too knowing for her age. She looked at Dutch, then back at Clayton. You were talking about my papa, about how he died. Clayton exchanged a glance with Dutch, then decided on honesty. Sarah had already lived through more hardship than most adults. She deserved truth, not comfortable lies. Yes, Clayton said simply. We were. Your papa's death might not have been an accident, Sarah. Someone might have hurt him on purpose. Sarah's small hand tightened on the doll. Because he was trying to help people. We think so. Your papa found out that some powerful men were cheating families out of their land. He was going to stop them, and they couldn't allow that. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but her voice remained steady. Mama said Papa was a hero, that he stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. Is that true? Yes, Clayton said firmly. That's absolutely true. Your papa was braver and better than any man I've known, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows it. I'm going to find the people who hurt him, and I'm going to make them answer for what they did. Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she said something that surprised Clayton completely. Can I help? Help? Find the bad men. Can I help you? Her young face was serious, determined. Papa was my papa. I should help make things right. Clayton felt his throat tighten with emotion. This child, barely 7 years old, had already lost everything. And instead of retreating into fear, she was offering to fight alongside him. She had Thomas's courage, his sense of justice, his refusal to look away from wrongs that needed righting. You can help? Clayton said gently. By being safe, by growing up strong, by becoming the person your papa would be proud of. That's the most important job, Sarah. Let me handle the dangerous work. The funeral for Rebecca Hartley took place on a clear morning when the skies stretched blue and infinite above the Texas plains. Clayton arranged everything himself, ensuring Rebecca received a dignity in death she had been denied in her final years. A proper coffin, a stone marker, a place on the hill beside Thomas where wildflowers grew in spring. Sarah stood between Clayton and Maria, dry-eyed and solemn as the pastor from Red Creek spoke words meant to comfort the living. The child had cried herself empty the night before, Maria reported, and now stood with the terrible composure of someone who had learned too young that tears changed nothing. A surprising number of townspeople attended. Dr. Harrison stood respectfully in the back. Harold Pritchard from the general store brought his wife. Even Virgil Stone from the bank made an appearance. These people had watched Rebecca struggle and die, had known about Sarah's poverty, and had done nothing substantial to help. Now they came to mourn, perhaps to ease their own guilt. Clayton noticed them all with a bitter awareness. How many other families had suffered while good people looked away, uncomfortable with poverty they could not solve? How many children like Sarah existed on the edges of towns, invisible to those with means? After the service, as people dispersed, Clayton stood alone at the two graves. Thomas's marker was older, weathered by 15 years of sun and rain. Rebecca's was new, the stone still bright and sharp-edged. Husband and wife, separated by distance and circumstance in life, finally together. I failed you both, Clayton said quietly. Failed Thomas by not knowing him, not seeing what was happening under my nose. Failed Rebecca by not being the kind of man she felt safe approaching. But I won't fail, Sarah. I promise you that. Talking to ghosts now, Mercer. Clayton turned to find Silas Crow standing a respectful distance away, hat in hand, his face arranged in an expression of sympathy that did not reach his eyes. Crow was a large man, running to fat in middle age, with the florid complexion of someone who enjoyed whiskey more than was wise. Paying respects, Clayton said evenly, keeping his voice neutral despite the rage that Crow's presence ignited. Heard you took in a child, Crow said, moving closer. The Hartley woman's daughter. That's charitable of you, though some might question the wisdom of it. Would they? Well, you're a bachelor, Mercer. Raising a young girl alone, it'll cause talk. People wonder about such arrangements. Crow's tone was casual, but there was threat beneath the words. And the child's of questionable parentage. The mother never married. Never named a father. Some might say you're bringing scandal into your household. Clayton understood the game immediately. Crow was testing him, seeing if Clayton knew about Sarah's true parentage, about Thomas, and he was threatening to spread rumors if Clayton did not back away from whatever investigation he suspected was beginning. My household arrangements are my own business, Clayton said coldly, as are my family connections. Crow's eyes narrowed slightly. Family connections? Sarah is my niece, Thomas's daughter. Rebecca and Thomas were engaged before his death. Clayton watched Crow's face carefully as he delivered this information, looking for any sign of recognition or guilt. What he saw was surprise, quickly masked but unmistakable. Crow had not known about Thomas and Rebecca, had not known Thomas had a child. Whatever Crow's involvement in Thomas's death, it had not been about silencing a man protecting his family. It had been purely about business, about covering up corruption. Somehow that made it worse. I had no idea, Crow said after a pause. Thomas kept that quiet. My condolences on his loss. All those years ago. Tragic accident. Was it? Clayton asked, his voice deceptively mild. The air between them grew tense. Crow's expression shifted, the false sympathy dropping away to reveal calculation beneath. Accidents happen on ranches, Crow said slowly. Equipment fails. Good men die. It's the way of things out here. Unless the equipment is sabotaged, Clayton replied, unless good men are murdered to keep them from exposing corruption. Crow's face flushed darker. That's a dangerous accusation, Mercer. The kind of talk that ruins reputations. The kind that might make a man reconsider his position in this community. Is that a threat? It's friendly advice, Crow said, his voice hardening. You've built something impressive here. Be ashamed to see it all come crashing down because you started asking questions better left alone. Clayton stepped closer, close enough that Crow had to look up slightly to meet his eyes. Let me give you some friendly advice in return. Stay away from my niece. Stay away from my ranch. And if I find proof you were involved in my brother's death, no amount of power or connections will save you. Crow held Clayton's stare for a long moment, then stepped back with a smile that was more snarl than amusement. You're making a mistake, Mercer, but I suppose some men have to learn things the hard way. Turned and walked away, climbing into his buggy with effort and driving off without looking back. Clayton watched him go, his mind already racing through next steps. Crow knew Clayton was investigating. That meant time was now a fact. Whatever evidence existed, Crow would move to destroy it. Maria appeared at Clayton's elbow, Sarah's hand held firmly in hers. That man brings trouble, Maria said quietly. Yes, Clayton agreed. He does. Sarah looked up at him with those dark, knowing eyes. Was that one of the bad men? Clayton hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I think he was. He looks mean, Sarah observed with a child's directness. He is mean, Clayton confirmed, which is why we need to be careful. Very careful. Over the following days, Clayton assembled his strategy with the same methodical precision he applied to business ventures. He needed evidence, legal proof that would stand up in court. Ben Cooper's testimony was valuable but insufficient on its own. He needed documents, records, something concrete that tied Crow to the corrupt land deals and Thomas's murder. Marcus Flynn was the key. Flynn had handled the transactions, created the false documents, arranged the intimidation. If anyone had kept records of the conspiracy, it would be Flynn. Lawyers were creatures of habit, and habit meant documentation. Clayton hired a lawyer from Austin, a man named James Crawford with a reputation for integrity and thoroughness. Crawford was expensive, but worth every penny. He understood land law, had experience with corruption cases, and most importantly, had no connections to the local power structure that might compromise his loyalty. These kinds of cases are difficult, Crawford warned during their first meeting in Clayton's study. You're essentially accusing prominent men of murder and fraud. The burden of proof is extraordinary, and the risk of retaliation is significant. I understand the risks, Clayton said, but I'm not backing down. Crawford studied him thoughtfully. May I ask why this matters so much? Your brother has been dead for 15 years. Pursuing this case will be expensive, dangerous, and may damage your own reputation if the evidence is insufficient. Clayton thought of Sarah, sleeping upstairs in the blue bedroom. He thought of Thomas's journal, of Rebecca's dying request, of all the families who had lost everything to greedy men who believed power made them untouchable. Because it's right, Clayton said simply, because my brother deserves justice. And because Sarah deserves to grow up in a world where powerful men answer for their crimes. Crawford nodded slowly. Then we'll need to move carefully. First step is obtaining Marcus Flynn's records. I can request them through legal channels, but that will tip our hand and give Flynn time to destroy evidence. What if we didn't go through legal channels? Clayton asked. Crawford's eyebrows rose. Mr. Mercer, I cannot advise you to break the law. You're not advising me. I'm simply asking hypothetically what we might need if such records were to become available through unofficial means. A slight smile crossed Crawford's face. Hypothetically, we would need original documents showing the actual land transactions, evidence of payments made to Flynn beyond normal legal fees, and ideally correspondence between Flynn and whoever hired him. And where would such documents likely be kept? Flynn maintains an office in Red Creek. He also has a residence there. Lawyers of his generation tend to keep important documents in home safes rather than office files. More secure, less accessible to clerks or competitors. Clayton filed this information away. Breaking into Flynn's home was risky and illegal, but it might be the only way to obtain proof before Crow had it destroyed. Dutch was less enthusiastic about the plan when Clayton presented it that evening. "Boss, this is burglary. If you're caught, everything you've built will be destroyed. Your reputation, your business, your ability to care for Sarah, all of it gone." "If I don't do this," Clayton countered, "Thomas's killers walk free. More families suffer, and Sarah grows up knowing her father's death meant nothing, that justice is only for those who can afford to avoid it." Dutch sighed heavily. "When? 3 days from now, there's a social gathering at the Patterson place, the big ranch east of town. Flynn will be there, all the prominent families will. His house will be empty, and you'll need someone to stand watch," Dutch concluded. "I'll need someone I trust absolutely," Clayton corrected. "Someone who understands what's at stake." Dutch was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with the decision. Then he nodded once. 3 days. But we plan this carefully, and we have an exit strategy if things go wrong." The 3 days passed with agonizing slowness. Clayton maintained his normal routine, tending to ranch business, spending evenings with Sarah. The child was adjusting gradually to her new life, though she still carried the awareness of someone expecting the good fortune to end abruptly. Maria had taken to teaching Sarah in the afternoons, basic reading and arithmetic that the girl absorbed with startling speed. Sarah was hungry for knowledge, for skills, for anything that might make her valuable. Clayton watched these lessons sometimes, marveling at how quickly she learned, how desperately she wanted to prove her worth. "You don't have to earn your place here," he told her one evening as they sat on the porch watching the sunset. "You belong here because you're family, not because of what you can do or learn." Sarah looked at him with those two old eyes. "Mama said the same thing. But I still want to learn. I want to be smart and useful." "Then learn because it makes you happy," Clayton suggested. "Learn because knowledge is valuable in itself, not because you think you have to deserve love." Sarah considered this, then leaned against his side slightly, a gesture of trust that made Clayton's throat tighten. "Uncle Clayton, will you tell me more about Papa? Mama told me some things, but she got tired so easy. She couldn't tell long stories. So Clayton told stories about Thomas as a boy, about their adventures together, about the time Thomas had tried to ride a stubborn mule and ended up in the water trough, about how Thomas could calm the most difficult horses with nothing but patience and gentle words, about his laugh, his kindness, his unwavering belief that people were fundamentally good. Sarah listened with complete attention, storing each detail like treasure, and Clayton found that talking about Thomas, sharing these memories with his daughter, eased something in his own chest. For 15 years he had locked Thomas away in silence. Now, speaking his brother's name aloud, celebrating his life instead of only mourning his death, felt like a form of healing. The night of the social gathering arrived cold and clear. Clayton dressed carefully in his best suit, the same outfit he wore for important business meetings. He left the ranch at dusk, riding justice toward Red Creek with Dutch, following at a discreet distance on his own horse. They had planned meticulously. Crawford had confirmed that Marcus Flynn and his wife would attend the Patterson gathering, that Flynn was expected to stay for several hours. Dutch would wait at the edge of town with the horses, while Clayton entered Flynn's home through a back window they had scouted earlier in the week. Flynn's house sat on a quiet street, a modest 2-story structure that spoke of comfortable income without flaunting wealth. The windows were dark, the street empty as most of Red Creek society attended the Patterson event. Clayton approached from the rear, his heart pounding harder than it had in decades. He was 52 years old, breaking into a home like a common criminal, risking everything on the belief that justice mattered more than safety. The window gave way easily, opened with tools Dutch had provided. Clayton climbed through with less grace than he would have liked, landing heavily in what appeared to be Flynn's study. He paused, listening for any sound that might indicate he was not alone. Silence. He lit the small lantern he had brought, keeping the flame low. The study was organized, almost obsessively so. Books lined one wall, legal texts arranged by topic. A desk dominated the space, its surface clear except for an inkwell and pen stand. And against the far wall stood a safe, exactly as Crawford had predicted. Clayton crossed to the safe, examining the lock. It was good quality but not exceptional. Dutch had taught him the basics of safe cracking years ago, a skill Clayton had never expected to use. He retrieved his tools and set to work, feeling for the tumblers, listening for the soft clicks that indicated progress. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air. Every sound from outside made him freeze, certain he had been discovered. But the street remained quiet, and gradually the safe's mechanism yielded to his patient manipulation. The door swung open. Inside, Clayton found what he had been searching for. A metal box filled with documents, correspondence, ledgers detailing payments and transactions that spanned 15 years. He began sorting through them quickly, his hands shaking slightly as he realized the scope of what Flynn had preserved. Here was a letter from Silas Crow, discussing the removal of a problem. There, a payment record showing thousands of dollars transferred to Flynn from Crow's accounts. Documents showing forged land titles, falsified surveys, intimidation of witnesses, and at the bottom of the box, a single page that made Clayton's blood run cold. A letter in Crow's handwriting, dated 2 days before Thomas's death, instructing Flynn to handle the Mercer situation permanently. Clayton's hands trembled as he held the letter, reading Crow's words again and again. Handle the Mercer situation permanently. There it was, written in Crow's own hand, incontrovertible proof of murder conspiracy. Thomas had been killed not in a moment of passion, but through calculated decision, ordered like a business transaction. He carefully gathered all the documents, stuffing them into the leather satchel he had brought. Every page was evidence, every ledger entry another nail in Crow's coffin. Clayton worked quickly but methodically, ensuring nothing was left behind that might alert Flynn to the theft before Clayton could act. A sound from outside froze him in place, footsteps on the front porch, a key turning in the lock. Someone was entering the house. Clayton extinguished his lantern immediately, plunging the study into darkness. His mind raced. Flynn was supposed to be at the Patterson gathering for hours yet. Had he returned early? Had someone seen Clayton enter? The front door opened. Voices, low and urgent. Not one person, but two, maybe three. Clayton moved silently toward the window he had entered through, clutching his satchel of evidence. If he could reach the window before they entered the study, he might escape unnoticed. But as he crossed the room, his boot caught the edge of a small table, sending a decorative vase crashing to the floor. The sound was explosive in the silent house. "Someone's here," a voice shouted, Marcus Flynn's voice high with alarm. In the study, Clayton abandoned stealth for speed, throwing himself toward the window. Behind him, the study door burst open, lamplight spilling in. He had one leg through the window when hands grabbed his coat, yanking him backward. Clayton twisted, driving his elbow into someone's ribs. The grip loosened, and he surged forward again, but more hands grasped him, pulling him fully back into the room. He hit the floor hard, the satchel flying from his hands. 3 men surrounded him. Marcus Flynn, his face pale and shocked, and 2 large men Clayton did not recognize, hired muscle by the look of them. One held a pistol, aimed steadily at Clayton's chest. "Clayton Mercer," Flynn said, his shock giving way to anger. "Breaking into my home, stealing my property. I never would have believed it." Clayton climbed to his feet slowly, raising his hands to show he was unarmed. His mind worked frantically, searching for a way out of this disaster. "Those documents are evidence of murder," Clayton said, keeping his voice level. "Evidence that you and Silas Crow conspired to kill my brother." Flynn's expression shifted, becoming calculating. "That's a serious accusation, the kind that could ruin a man's life if spoken publicly." "The kind that's true," Clayton shot back. "Truth is relative, Mr. Mercer, especially when the only evidence is in documents stolen through criminal activity. No court would accept them." Flynn gestured to one of his men. "Search him. Make sure he has nothing else." Rough hands patted Clayton down, removing the lock-picking tools, a small knife he carried, but they missed the single document Clayton had folded into his boot before entering, a precaution Dutch had insisted upon. If he was caught, at least one piece of evidence might survive. "What do we do with him?" one of the hired men asked. Flynn paced, thinking, "We can't just let him go. He knows too much, and he'll talk. But killing him outright would raise questions." "Mercer's a prominent man. An accident, then?" the other man suggested. "He broke in. We defended our property. Things got out of hand." Clayton felt cold dread settle into his bones. They were discussing his murder with the casual efficiency of men who had done this before. How many others had stood in this study, realizing too late that their pursuit of justice had led them to their deaths? "No," Flynn said finally. "There's a better way. We take him to Crow. Let Crow decide what to do with him. This is his problem as much as mine." They bound Clayton's hands with rough rope, the knots tight enough to cut off circulation. One of the men retrieved the satchel of documents, while the other kept the gun trained on Clayton's chest. Flynn gathered his coat and hat with methodical care, as if preparing for a routine evening visit rather than delivering a man to his likely execution. "You should have left well enough alone, Mercer," Flynn said as they prepared to leave. "Your brother made the same mistake, thinking justice mattered more than survival." "Justice always matters," Clayton replied quietly. "That's the difference between us." They led him out the back way to avoid being seen, loading him into a covered wagon like cargo. The wagon rumbled through the darkness toward Crow's ranch, each jolt sending pain through Clayton's bound wrists. He forced himself to think clearly despite the fear clawing at his chest. Dutch was still out there, waiting with the horses. When Clayton did not return at the appointed time, Dutch would know something had gone wrong. But what could Dutch do against Flynn's hired guns and Crow's small army of ranch hands? Going to the Raras might be the smart move, but by the time Dutch rode to town, convinced the lawman to act, and returned, Clayton could be dead and buried in some remote pasture. The wagon stopped. Voices called out, and someone responded from Crow's ranch house. Lamplight spilled from windows as the front door opened. Clayton was hauled roughly from the wagon and marched up the steps, his legs stiff from the journey. Silas Crow stood in his parlor, a glass of whiskey in hand, his face flushed from drink and heat. He looked at Clayton with surprise that quickly transformed into understanding. "Well now," Crow said slowly, "this is unexpected. Marcus, I thought you were attending the Patterson gathering." "I returned early," Flynn explained. "Something told me to check my house. Good thing, too, found Mercer here, breaking into my safe, stealing documents." Crow's eyes narrowed. "What documents?" Flynn gestured to one of his men, who produced the satchel. Crow set down his whiskey and opened it, pulling out papers and examining them. His face darkened as he read, the flush of drink giving way to something colder and more dangerous. "You stupid fool," Crow hissed at Flynn. "You kept all of this? Letters, payment records, everything? I told you to destroy it years ago." "I kept it as insurance," Flynn said defensively, "in case you ever decided to make me a liability." And now you've led him right to it. Crow threw the papers across the room in fury. Do you have any idea what this means? These documents could put us both in prison for life, or worse, at the end of a rope. Clayton watched this exchange with cold satisfaction despite his circumstances. Seeing the conspiracy unravel, watching the co-conspirators turn on each other, provided grim vindication. It doesn't matter now, Flynn said, trying to recover his composure. Mercer's the only one who knows about them. We deal with him, destroy the evidence, and the problem goes away. Deal with him? Crow laughed bitterly. He's not some day laborer who can disappear without questions. He's Clayton Mercer, one of the richest men in the territory. People will notice if he vanishes. They'll investigate, and we'll be the first suspects. Then what do you suggest? Flynn asked. Crow paced, thinking. Clayton could see the calculations happening behind his eyes, weighing options, considering consequences. This was a man who had murdered before, and would do so again if the benefit outweighed the risk. We need leverage, Crow said finally. Something that ensures Mercer's silence even if he lives. There's nothing he values more than exposing us, Flynn argued. There's the girl, one of Crow's men said from the doorway. The orphan he took in. Word around town is he's grown attached to her. Clayton's blood turned to ice. Sarah. They were going to threaten Sarah. No, Clayton said, his voice harder than steel. You leave her out of this. She's a child. She has nothing to do with any of this. Crow smiled, the expression predatory. On the contrary, Mercer, she has everything to do with this. She's your weakness, your vulnerability. You'll keep quiet about what you found to protect her. And if you don't, well, accidents happen to children too. Rage flooded Clayton, hot and absolute. He lunged toward Crow despite his bound hands, driven by pure protective fury. One of Crow's men hit him hard across the back of the head with something heavy. Pain exploded through Clayton's skull, and the world tilted sickeningly. He hit the floor, consciousness wavering. Through the haze, he heard Crow speaking. Put him in the root cellar. Keep him there while we figure out the permanent solution. And send someone to watch the Mercer ranch. If the girl tries to leave or if anyone comes looking for Clayton, I want to know immediately. Hands grabbed Clayton, dragging him. He tried to resist, but his body would not cooperate, limbs heavy and unresponsive. They pulled him downstairs into darkness that smelled of earth and cold. A door slammed shut, leaving him in absolute blackness. Clayton lay on the packed dirt floor, fighting to remain conscious, fighting to think through the pain and fear. Sarah was in danger. Everything he had tried to do, every risk he had taken, had only put her at greater risk. Time lost meaning in the darkness. Clayton drifted in and out of consciousness, his head throbbing where he had been struck. His wrists bled from the ropes, and cold seeped up from the earthen floor, settling into his bones. But through the pain and disorientation, one thought remained crystalline. He had to protect Sarah. Whatever happened to him, whatever price he paid for his pursuit of justice, Sarah had to survive this unharmed. He forced himself to focus, to assess his situation methodically. The root cellar was small, perhaps 8 feet square. The walls were earth-reinforced with stone. The door thick wood that had not budged when he had thrown himself against it earlier. No windows, no other exits. He was trapped effectively, but he still had the document in his boot. With difficulty, Clayton maneuvered his bound hands toward his feet. The rope prevented him from bending fully, and every movement sent pain through his shoulders. But desperation lent him flexibility he had not possessed in decades. His fingers found his boot top, worked inside, and retrieved the folded paper. It was Crow's letter ordering Thomas's death, the most damning piece of evidence, preserved by luck and Dutch's paranoid planning. If Clayton died here, if Crow succeeded in silencing him, this letter could still bring justice, but only if someone found it, if it reached the right hands. Clayton carefully worked the letter deeper into his boot, pressing it flat against his calf, where it would not be immediately visible if they searched him again. It was a slim hope, but hope nonetheless. Above him, footsteps crossed the floor. Voices, muffled but urgent. Clayton pressed his ear to the earthen wall, straining to hear. Marshals asking questions. Someone reported seeing Mercer's horse near Flynn's place. Tell him Mercer left town. Business trip to Austin. Won't believe it. Mercer never leaves without telling his foreman. The voices faded. Clayton's heart raced. Someone had noticed his absence, had reported it. That meant Dutch had survived, had raised the alarm. The marshal was involved now, which changed everything. Crow could not simply make Clayton disappear without facing serious investigation, but that also made Clayton more dangerous to keep alive. If the marshal was asking questions, Crow's safest move was to kill Clayton quickly and dispose of the body where it would never be found. The cellar door opened abruptly, lamplight blinding after hours of darkness. Clayton squinted against the glare as someone descended the stairs. Not Crow or Flynn, but a younger man Clayton did not recognize. One of Crow's ranch hands by the look of him. The man set the lamp down and studied Clayton with an expression that was hard to read. "You're Mercer, the one who took in the Hartley girl." Clayton said nothing, waiting. "My sister worked for the Hartleys years back," the man continued, "before they lost their land. Good people, my sister said. Then one day they were gone. Run off their property by legal tricks. My sister never forgot that, never forgot how wrong it was. Understanding dawned. What's your name?" "Jack Reeves. And I heard what Crow and Flynn said up there. About Thomas Mercer. About the land deals, about all of it." Jack glanced toward the stairs, ensuring they were alone. "My sister's family was one of the ones they cheated. And now I work for the man who did it, because jobs are scarce and I've got a family to feed." "I'm sorry," Clayton said, meaning it. "Don't be sorry. Be smart." Jack pulled a knife from his belt. Clayton tensed, but Jack moved behind him and cut the ropes binding his wrists. "I can't let you out. Not yet. Too many men loyal to Crow would see, and I'd be killed alongside you. But I can give you a chance." Clayton rubbed his wrists, trying to restore circulation. "What kind of chance?" "Tomorrow morning Crow's sending most of the men to drive cattle to the north pasture. It's a big job. Needs everyone. I'll be expected to go too. When we leave there'll only be 2 men guarding you, maybe 3. That's still too many for me to fight," Clayton said. "Maybe, but you're Clayton Mercer. You didn't build an empire by giving up when the odds were bad." Jack picked up the lamp and moved toward the stairs. "Your foreman, Dutch. He's camped about a mile south of here, watching the ranch. If you can get out, head south. He'll find you." "Why are you helping me?" Jack paused at the top of the stairs. "Because 15 years ago, someone should have stood up to Crow. Someone should have stopped him. Maybe if they had, my sister's family would still have their land. Maybe a lot of families would be better off." He looked back at Clayton. "You're standing up now. That matters." The door closed, leaving Clayton in darkness again. But this time, the darkness held possibility. 6 months later, autumn painted the Texas landscape in shades of gold and amber. Clayton stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching Sarah race across the yard with Dutch's old dog, her laughter carrying on the cool morning air. She wore a proper dress now, sturdy boots, her hair tied back with a ribbon that was blue but new, not torn and faded, like the one that had first caught his attention. The months between that dark night in Crow's cellar and this peaceful morning had been filled with chaos and resolution. Jack Reeves had been true to his word. When most of Crow's men left for the cattle drive, Clayton had fought his way past the remaining guards with the desperate strength of a man protecting someone he loved. Dutch had found him half a mile from Crow's ranch, bleeding and exhausted but alive. The document hidden in his boot, combined with Ben Cooper's testimony and Jack Reeves's willingness to turn witness, had been enough. The marshal arrested Marcus Flynn first, and Flynn, facing a murder charge, had broken completely. He provided detailed testimony about Crow's involvement, about the years of corruption, about Thomas's murder planned and executed with cold precision. Silas Crowe was convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and multiple counts of fraud. He would spend the rest of his life in prison, his ranch seized and sold to pay restitution to the families he had cheated. Marcus Flynn received a lesser sentence in exchange for his cooperation, but his reputation was destroyed, his legal career finished. Clayton had personally returned every acre of land acquired through Flynn's corrupt deals. He found the displaced families, some as far away as California, and offered them their property back or fair compensation. His empire shrank significantly, but what remained was honest, built on legitimate deals and hard work rather than theft. The town of Red Creek had been scandalized, then gradually accepted. Clayton's willingness to make things right, to sacrifice his own wealth for justice, had earned him a different kind of respect than his money ever had. People looked at him differently now, with warmth instead of wariness. Sarah called to him from the yard. "Uncle Clayton, watch this." She demonstrated a trick Dutch had taught her, making the dog jump through her arms. Clayton applauded, his chest tight with an emotion he had spent most of his adult life avoiding. Love, pure, uncomplicated, terrifying love for this child who had grabbed his hand and changed everything. Maria emerged from the house with coffee and fresh bread. "She's doing well with her studies," Maria reported. "The tutor says she's reading at a level well beyond her age, and her arithmetic is exceptional." "She gets that from Thomas," Clayton said. "He was always quick with numbers." They had visited the graves that morning, as they did every Sunday. Sarah placed wildflowers she had picked herself, talking to the parents she had known and lost. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it coexisted now with joy, with belonging, with the knowledge that she was loved and wanted. Dr. Harrison's buggy appeared on the road, unusual for a Sunday. Clayton felt a moment of concern, but the doctor's expression was pleased as he climbed down. "Mr. Mercer, I wanted to tell you in person. The orphanage in Austin, the one you've been funding, they've placed 6 more children with families this month. Good families, people who want children not for labor but for love. Your donations made that possible." Clayton nodded, pleased but uncomfortable with the praise. He had discovered that wealth, properly used, could heal some of the damage it had caused when improperly gained. Funding orphanages, supporting education, helping families in need. These things mattered in ways that accumulating land never had. "It's the least I can do," Clayton said. "It's more than most do," Dr. Harrison corrected gently. "Thomas would be proud of you, of how you're raising his daughter, of how you've used this terrible situation to create good." After the doctor left, Clayton walked to where Sarah played. She ran to him immediately, taking his hand with the easy trust that still amazed him. "Uncle Clayton, can we ride to the creek later? Dutch said he saw turtles there yesterday." "We can," Clayton agreed. "But first, I have something for you." He pulled a small package from his pocket. Sarah opened it carefully, revealing Thomas's pocket watch. Clayton had taken it to a watchmaker in Austin, had it cleaned and repaired. The hands moved again, ticking away seconds that mattered because they were shared. "It works now," Sarah whispered, holding it reverently. "Yes," Clayton said. "Time moves forward, Sarah. We carry the past with us. We honor it, but we don't let it stop us from living." He knelt beside her, meeting her eyes. "Your papa and mama would want you to be happy, to live fully. Can you do that?" Sarah hugged him fiercely, the watch pressed between them. "I can, because I have you." Clayton held his niece, his daughter in all the ways that mattered, and felt the weight of 15 years of grief finally begin to lift. He had found something worth more than all the land in Texas. He had found family. He had found home. And on the hill overlooking the ranch, 2 graves stood side by side, marked with stones that read simply, "Thomas Mercer, beloved brother and father," and Rebecca Hartley Mercer, beloved mother and friend. Together at last, as they should have been in life. The blue ribbons Sarah had clutched that first day hung in a frame in Clayton's study now, beside the photograph of Thomas and Rebecca, besides Sarah's cloth doll she had insisted on keeping. Artifacts of love and loss, preserved not in sorrow but in celebration of lives that had mattered, of connections that transcended death. Some fortunes are measured in gold, but the greatest are measured in love, in second chances, in the courage to change. Clayton Mercer had learned this lesson late, bought it with pain and loss, and regret. But he had learned it, and in learning he had finally become the man his brother always believed he could be.